and who also holds the Arnhold Professorship in International Cooperation and Development. And Henry Arnhold was always inspired by the thoughtful and relevant work at the New School, and especially by Willi's work. I first met Willi after a conversation with Henry about climate change. And he pointed me to Willi's emerging work in that space. Will Milberg, I don't know if Will's here today, there he is. Will also played a role in connecting us, because I was always talking to Will about and asking him which of the NSSR economists are working on climate. Willi and I quickly found common ground in our work, and in a classic New School tradition, sought to enrich the places where our shared scholarship, or better yet, the places where our disciplines were expanded by the interplay among them and between them, and where we could engage in the applied and urgent challenge of climate change adaptation and mitigation. Willi has played no small part in lifting up this work within the field of economics, policy, and education in ways that have made the university he has called home for the past 45 years, just sit with that for a moment, a natural place to further center this work across all of our fields. I know Teresa will speak about Marxism, yes, and Leninism, no. Just had to check. And also more about Willi's work in depth, but I just wanted to add two thoughts, promises, really. That the New School will continue to advance and deepen the work Willi has started here, especially on the economics of climate change. And I know that while we are here to honor and celebrate him on his retirement, I simply refuse to contemplate a New School without him. And so I'm going to count on his ongoing collaboration and his contribution to these critical endeavors. He is, simply put, a brilliant scholar and a good friend, and I thank him personally and on behalf of the New School for what you have done. Thank you, Willi.
Thank you. Well, I'm here to praise Willi Semmler, not to say goodbye, of course. And I sincerely want to say what people often say, and maybe they say without the depth and specificity as I'm saying it now. And as the chair of the department, as director of the Center for the Schwartz Center for. Sorry, everybody online. I can say with depth and sincerity and specificity and sincerity, as the chair of the economics department and as the director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, which is part of the economics department, the center and the department is dedicated to solving problems facing humanity, that I can't know how we are going to live without you, Willi, and I can't imagine even trying to replace you. Let me tell you one fact. When we were considering hiring, we were considering needing to have on staff a permanent econometrics teacher. And we decided, oh, did we not? And Willi just humbly raised his hand and said, we really do. I'm on over 25 dissertation committees at the moment because there is no econometrician on staff. It was humble, but I think all of us in the room realized that we would have never done that kind of work, for any kind of department. But Willi was doing it year after year after year. Whenever I have a really bright student and they've disappeared, and I would ask, well, why didn't you come work with me on a dissertation? It's usually because they're working with Willi Semmler, and they're almost done. And they're almost done with their dissertation. That kind of throughput, Willi, we will never be able to replace. I also want to tell you something about the kind of economic problem that Willi works on. It's one of the most the nastiest problem in economics. because it's very specific. It's focused on change, and it's focused on change that requires a lot of expense now in order to solve a problem later. And that's very hard to do in a policy forum. I know I have to do that in retirement and economic security. We have to spend something now so we don't have a humanitarian disaster in the future. Well, Willi is on the same plane. It's what finance does. We look to the future, we have to discount, but to tell people to bring forward the future and imagine the future costs as if they're happening now is very, very difficult for any policy advocate, and it's something that economists must do all the time. I also want to say something about his scholarship and about him as a person, as an economist. And that's something that I couldn't put a finger on until very, very late last night. I was reading The End of the Worldly Philosophers by Robert Heilbronner. And I wanted to see what economist actually Heilbronner stopped with. And it wasn't Keynes, as I had remembered. It was Schumpeter. And Heilbronner, Robert Heilbronner, a protein person in our department, said there was two big differences between Keynes and Schumpeter. And that was that Keynes, at the end of his life, wrote The Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren, where he looked to the future and he saw something better. But Schumpeter looked to the future and just saw all decline. He was pessimistic. Keynes was optimistic. Willi, you fall so much in the Keynes camp, even though you describe the end of the world as we know it. You're hopeful and cheerful that we will find a solution for it. Willi isn't retiring. All of you who know him well knows that he has a lot of ideas and a lot of projects underway. And I want to leave you with an image of that Willi Semmler, who will never stop working. And it comes from right after a lunch that a number of us had with Willi. We were walking out of the out of the restaurant. I think Will Milberg might remember this. And Willi was kind of coming back, and under his breath said, "You know, I've got another project I'm going to do." And Will just lost it. Will Milberg just lost it. He said, "Oh, Willi, really? You have another project?" And he poked at his front jacket and says, "Oh, you got a project in there." And then he pointed to Willi's right pocket, said, "You got a project here? You got a project here?" And then he opened up his jacket and said, "And you got a project here, and you got a project here." I'll always remember you that way, that you're filled with about 10 projects, like you were filled with like 25 dissertation, at the same time. Um, um, Really light up the world like you lit up us. You gave so generously to us. I hope all the many academic children you have will carry on your vision, and most of all, your optimism. Thank you, Willi.
Thank you very much, Joel and Teresa. That was wonderful. Moving on now to our three keynote speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce first Bruce Greenwald, who is the Robert Heilbronner Professor Emeritus of Finance and Asset Management at Columbia Business School and the Academic Director of the Heilbronner Center for Graham Dodd Investing. Bruce has been described by the New York Times as a guru to Wall Street gurus. Hans-Helmut Kotz, who will join us online, is resident fellow at the Center for European Studies and visiting professor of economics at Harvard. He's also affiliated with the Goethe University in Frankfurt and Freiburg University. And Hans-Helmut is also a former board member of the Bundesbank. And finally, David Abraham is Professor Emeritus of Law at the University of Miami, having previously taught German and European history at Princeton. And David is also a former law clerk for Judge Leonard Garth on the Third Circuit of the U.S. Court of Appeals. So, Bruce, okay. I'll ask you to take the stage first, and I'll keep time.
All right, let me say two things about that introduction. The first is the part of my career where I've dealt with Willi and been inspired by Willi has nothing to do with asset management. Second thing is that the Guru to Wall Street Journals was in the New York Times. If you're smart, you won't believe it. So let me say, in my role as a traditional economist, which is how I began life. Normally, by the way, I don't need a microphone to make myself heard, but then I've never really been much online in my lifetime. Willi and the department that he has focused, or fostered rather, here at the New School, in the context of an increasingly inward-looking and narrowly technically focused economics profession, has been a beacon of light to those of us who did not want to die of boredom and irrelevance. And therefore, it is a real pleasure, A, to be here to honor him, but B, to join the mob that's trying to make sure that he doesn't give it up and go off into the sunset. What I'm going to talk about in particular detail is a subject that was the subject of Willi's first book. I think of it, having gone through on Google his articles, I think of it as work for the late 1970s. Willi told me today the book did not come out till 1984. The point is, this is a truly well-aged piece of work, and I think it has stood the test of time in inspiring a lot of work that I'm going to talk about that Joe Stiglitz and I have done in this area. On the other hand, there is an unfinished agenda in those pockets of Willi. When you think of left-wing economics, I think that there is one area of massive failure. And I think given Willi's energy and the quality of his work, you really want to focus him on that area. And I'm going to talk very briefly about that. So the first part of this, which is going to be about economic structure and the implications of economic structure, is the Marxism, yes. The subject that I hope he will address next, or at some point in the future, is the Leninism, no, which is the really long-term failure of corrective government intervention on all sorts of levels. And I think that there may be structural reasons for that. Now, you know what I've forgotten is you see that black thing? They're going to let me control the slides here. Nope. Ah, there we go. Okay. So when I talk about Marxism, yes, what we're talking about here is the importance of structural change in economics. And the reason that doesn't typically get addressed is there's nothing stationary about that. There's nothing in the standard ergodic notion of what's scientific and mathematical about fundamental changes that occur. And yet in economics, they're absolutely critical to both policy and, I think, understanding. These changes are rare. You ought to understand that right away. I think in our lifetimes, there have been two. One is the essential death of agriculture and the replacement of agricultural activity by manufacturing and industry. And the second, which we're going through today with really very unhappy consequences, is the death of manufacturing and the transition to a service economy. In a sense, this is Schumpeterian creative destruction, where the creation doesn't seem to work as well and as easily as the destruction. Now, I think there are two themes that I've always admired about Willi's work that I think are important in talking about. First is, when you talk about heroes and villains, I'm virtuous, you're a scumbag, in economics, it's not an invitation to good policy. And I think it's important to understand here, and I think this is really an important theme in Marx, that there are no villains in the death of these six sectors. There are no villains in these transitions. What's going on inevitably is that productivity growth is outpacing demand growth. And there's no way you're going to stop that. In looking, though, at these processes seriously, there are two dimensions I think you have to look at. The first is the process of transition, getting from one economy to another. And the second is the difference in endpoints, what the destination economy looks like versus what the origin economy looks like. And I'm going to talk about both of those, having now put down the, oh, here it is. Sorry. In the death of agriculture, it seems to me historically, the huge problem was the problem of transition, that it's moving people off the farms into the industrial economy. So if you look at the early 1920s, agricultural related business cycles are self-correcting. And that's the characteristic of most business cycles. They are self-correcting. There's a short, sharp decline and a longer, slower recovery. In the early 20s, 21, 23, when agricultural prices collapse, you have high levels of outmigration from the farms because the farm balance sheets are really strong and they can afford to pay for the movement. You don't have problems of imperfect information in financial markets. Over the course of the 20s, those balance sheets deteriorate, and you see something very peculiar happen in 1929. That as prices drop in late 1929, you don't see large outmigration. Outmigration goes to zero because they can't afford to move anymore. So what you see is progressive immiseration that does not look like a normal business cycle and happens all over the world. Late 1929 is bad. 1930 is worse because they're all still on the farms. Productivity continues to grow and production continues to outstrip demand. 1931 is worse still. 1932 is bad, and early 1933 is bad. Over the course of that period, agricultural incomes, which support 35% of the US population, fall by 80%. And that happens to agricultural economies or agricultural sectors throughout the world. Now, you then see something that you're seeing again today, which is characteristic of these transitions. Everybody tries to save agricultural jobs. And the way they try and do it is through exports. The problem is when you add up over all the economies, the exports and the imports have to sum to zero. So Argentina and Australia devalue very early. They do well early in the Depression, but later on it catches up with them as other people devalue. There's no salvation here through trade. The remedy that historically has been talked about is the Keynesian remedy of the war. And I think you have to understand that that is wrong. And the reason I say that's wrong is that the Keynesians, Alvin Hansen and Paul Samuelson most notably, were running around Washington in 1944 and 45 saying the Depression is coming back. And it didn't. And presumably the reason it didn't is, except in countries like Uruguay, Argentina, and Spain that didn't really participate economically in the war, is that World War II was inadvertently extraordinarily successful industrial policy. It moved everybody off the farms into the factories, some of them via the army, at government expense. And so when, after the war, all that war demand disappeared, the people were in the places they had to be to fulfill the now bigger demand for manufacturing. And it's interesting that that failure of Keynesian forecasting has no place in the Keynesian view of the world. On the other hand, in this transition, once the transition is done, wrong direction, life is sweet. And this is where I think the Marxist insights cut most important. Production units go from being small and decentralized to large and centralized. To give you an example, there was a factory in Kearney, New Jersey that made telephones that in 1947 had 53,000 workers. you can put a lot of managers and a lot of engineers to work on those concentrated facilities to raise productivity. Decentralized is much harder to do. I mean, the greatest US government program, which in fact sort of created modern agriculture, is the Agricultural Extension Service. And without that, which was part of the Land Grant College Act, it's extremely unlikely, I think, that you would have seen the kind of productivity growth that you saw in agriculture. It's very hard to do with small decentralized units. The production process on farms, you have the kulak problem. You have individual small teams working separately. And as we know from George Stigler's work on doctors and lawyers, individual practitioner distributions of income are far more unequal than of large firms. But now you go to collective production processes. In these big factories, it's very hard to know who is critical, and you tend to get the average pay. So you go from low productivity growth to high productivity growth. You go from unequal incomes to more equal incomes. And in terms of competition, the division between profits and labor income, after the war, because the markets for differentiated manufacturers are local, you tend to see small markets that can be dominated by small numbers of firms, and profit share goes up. But as globalization proceeds, the profits become exactly what they were in the commodity economies before this transition. So the destination here is high productivity growth, low inequality, and high wage share at the expense of profit share. And this is what the Europeans referred to as the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years after the war. And it is explicable entirely in terms of this particular transition. There are no heroes or villains in this. Well, if you look at what's going on today, those big manufacturing plants are disappearing, and it's been going on really for 30 to 40 years. And you're going to services. And that is very much a reversal. Now, fortunately, the process of transition has been relatively more simple and straightforward, because you don't have to move people off farms. You don't have to sort of abandon a whole lot of housing in rural areas for urban areas. Service jobs are dispersed. And what you see, therefore, is not what you saw in the Depression. You see self-correcting cycles. Now, there are always problems here because in a crucial sector, there is chronic excess supply, but it is correctable. So 81, 82, which is a bad recession, is a 9-month downturn and a long, slow recovery. 90, 91 is a small disturbance, 2001. But 2008, 2009 is also self-correcting. It's nothing like what you saw in the Depression. On the other hand, global imbalances are still there. They are still irrelevant, and they drive everybody nuts. Everybody, including our president, is trying to save manufacturing jobs through exports. Lots of luck with that. But the Chinese have tried to do it. The Japanese have tried to do it. The Europeans and the Germans have tried to do it. The Koreans, the Indonesians, and the Thais didn't used to do it, but now they do it. To give you an example of how little the trade part of this matters, most of you in this room aren't old enough to remember this, but Ross Perot ran for president in 1992 on the giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico. If you look at the history of manufacturing jobs, and it should say from 1980 to 1991, US manufactured demand increased 31% in real terms. You look at US production, it increased 25% in real terms. 6% of that went to the giant sucking sound of jobs going overseas in general. Employment in manufacturing fell by 9%. So the difference between 31 and 25, which is 6%, and 25 and minus 9, which is 34%, is the difference between productivity growth and the difference in trade. Same is going to be true today, but lots of luck convincing people of that. The good news is there is no depression. To an extent, probably the biggest transitional problem from manufacturing to services is not economic, it's cultural. Service jobs are women's jobs. Manufacturing jobs tend to be men's jobs. And you see it. Right now, we've got a situation, I suppose you all know this data, where something like 60% of college graduates are women. And they are the ones who are doing absolutely the best in this new economy. And it's not an easy thing to adjust to. But the economic adjustment has been much smoother, nothing like the Depression. Here's the problem. If you look at origins versus destinations, you're going from large production units, centralized production units, to small decentralized. And the cost in productivity has been brutal. From 1960 to 1990, European per capita income grew at 3.5%. Since then, it's grown at 0.9%. In the last 5 years, it's grown below that. If you look at Japan, and everybody knows this, it's 0.5% to 0.9%. The irony here is that Europe has just exactly fallen off the same cliff as the Japanese, and people don't talk about it. The US has actually done the best in these circumstances, from 2.5 to 1.5, but that's still a huge difference. At 2.5% a year, incomes double roughly every 24 years. At 1.5%, it takes 50 years to double incomes. If you look at the production processes in services, they are individual. So you're going from collective production to individual production, and surprise, surprise, inequality is way up. I can do this. I'm almost done, actually. Competition is not what you see. In services, services are locally produced and consumed. And actually, those small markets have also been mirrored in tech. So you have small local markets in geography for services. And if you look at the big tech companies, they're all specialized. It's not the big IBMs. They're small, narrow markets that they dominate. And this is something that, ironically, people have, outside, I suspect, the new school, largely ignored. US profit share of national income, this is corporate profits, has gone from 8.5% in 1990 to 16% last year. It has been an enormous change. And that's one of the reasons the stock market has not reverted to the mean, as a lot of people expect. But it is a huge distortion in traditional income distribution. It's exacerbated by inequalities in labor income, and it is practically made unbearable by the slow rate of productivity growth. And nobody is talking about coping with this structural change. I think that's the worst indictment of the economics profession that I can think of. And that's why, Willi, you got to stick to it unless there's an obvious successor out there. But what I want to talk about is, given this advantage of what I take to be a neo-Marxist perspective, which is much broader than the standard economics perspective, why has this had so little impact on policy? And I think there you have to look at the record of left-wing economics, and it is a disaster. This is 1992 to 94. This is after the transition from the socialist economies. You look at matched countries like the Baltic, where Finland was poorer before World War II than Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. By the end of the communist experience, or the socialist left-wing experience, life expectancy is 6 years longer, and income per capita is more than twice. You can go down area by area. This is not just Russian influence. China versus Taiwan is, if anything, more extreme. Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam versus Thailand looks the same. North and South Korea, you see the difference. You can look at it in Cuba today and in Venezuela today. This is uniform. And by the way, the life expectancy numbers are the UN numbers, which are self-reported. The economic numbers are done by independent agencies that judge this, mostly at the University of Pennsylvania. Look at North versus South Korea on life expectancy. So those are probably dishonest numbers on life expectancy anyway. The question then is, you have to own this if you're a Marxist, and you have to think about why this has happened. And there are sort of more moderate versions of this that have impaired the fight against climate change. And the version of it I think is important. And this is just, I'm going to ad-lib, so you have to give me 2 minutes to do this. And then I'm going to talk about econometrics. What is striking about the fight against climate change is that the simplest, most obvious way to do it has never been tried. And it is this. It is a fully refundable carbon tax where you collect an enormous amount of money and on an equal per capita basis, you distribute it monthly or quarterly, but you give it away. Nobody will do that. And you have to ask yourself why. And I think that's Leninism in action. There's nothing about that that contributes to the exercise of power of the people in charge. In the economy of power, that is a loser all the time. And I think you need people like Willi to start talking about that and thinking seriously about those mechanisms. Lastly, when Willi said you needed an econometrician, I began life as an econometrician. You do not need an econometrician. I had an absolutely superb econometrics teacher named Frank Fisher. The first day we came into class, he showed a Peanuts cartoon. The first thing is a great big black dot with a lot of little black dots around it. The second picture is Charlie Brown looking at that and saying, Lucy, I found the queen bug. The third picture is Lucy looking at it and saying, Charlie Brown, that's not the queen bug, that's a black jelly bean. And the last frame is Charlie Brown saying, I wonder how a black jelly bean got to be the queen bug. What Frank Fisher said is 70% of data analysis is understanding before you go into it the difference between a black jelly bean and a queen bug. And that's what Willi is always known to do. So you're lucky that you didn't waste a slot on an econometrician. Thank you.
Many thanks, Bruce. That was wonderful. And your timekeeping was impeccable as well, I have to say. So our next speaker, where's Kendrick, the tech maestro? Next speaker is going to be joining us on Zoom, Hans-Helmut Kotz.
Hello, good afternoon, or good evening. I hope you can hear me.
We can. We're just trying to get you onto the screen.
Okay, excellent. I haven't been doing this Zooming for a while in terms of presenting, so I hope it works. Shall I put up the slides?
There we are. Perfect. Hans-Helmut, we can see you, and so the floor is yours.
But you can't see the slides I've prepared, or do you?
No. Do we enable, Hendrik, can we enable screen sharing here? Oh. Do what? Hans-Helmut, I'm being told you need to click share screen.
Ah, okay.
And then choose your slides from the window.
Well, I can't find it here. Sorry. Here. Can you see the slides now?
No.
Okay, they're not really important. They are structured along. Oh, they are. They are structured along three works of Professor Semmler, which have been really important for me. So what I'm doing is, when I thought about how to celebrate Willi's work, I should go down memory lane. And actually, memory lane starts with me as a student at the end of the 70s. At that time, Willi and two co-authors had written a 2-volume book, which was highly influential amongst students who at the time were usually only fed very much traditional economics. So this is a slide which I wanted to show you actually. It has a beautiful cover. Volkswagen turned on its head. And the title of the book, the two books actually, was Vom Wirtschaftswunder zur Wirtschaftskrise. From the economic miracle, as Bruce alluded to, les Trente Glorieuses, and they were called in the German case Wirtschaftswunder, from Wirtschaftswunder to the crisis. And it was in fact an environment where for the first time in Western Germany, unemployment rate went above 5 percentage points. So that was seen as highly critical. And the tools to deal with that were provided by the Council of Economic Advisors, who is our, in Germany, who is our has somehow this similar role as the Council of Economic Advisors in the US, and it was supply side economics. So after reading that book, 2 years later, I first met Willi in person at a conference in Bavaria, organized by what was called at the time Arbeitskreis Politische Ökonomie, so Association of Political Economists. And you had 3 churches there: Marxists, Keynesians, and some sort of radical neoclassicists. They were called Regensburger at the time. So that was a very lively environment, and I deeply enjoyed first time meeting up with Willi and learning a lot from him. I don't actually recall what the title of his presentation was. I know mine, it was about the shadow economy. When we had this exchange, that was this environment where the German economy was supposed to go ever more towards a crisis context. First mentions of the sick man of Europe came up. Turned out this was a diagnosis which was done a number of times later on. So there seemed to be, as Bruce mentioned it, there seemed to be a correcting cycle in the German case. Next time I met Willi in person was about 6 years later. Meanwhile, he had debarked to the US, and I met him at the New School, where he now was about to become a tenured professor. And he invited me to give a talk on tensions in the European monetary system. As you might recall, that was a fixed exchange rate system established after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. It was a fixed but adjustable system, and it basically meant that the monetary policy for the European monetary system for its member states was run out of Frankfurt by the Bundesbank, and that created at times significant tensions because the remaining member states just had to follow suit. And from then on, I rather frequently talked with Willi about Europe, about European monetary policy, European fiscal policy, and the tensions which were created out of the diversity which was going on in European policy making. What impressed me most at the time was that Willi showed me around the New School. This was a place which I had always held in awe. It was here where German academics fleeing the Nazi regime found refuge. It were in particular philosophers from Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer. But it were also economists, which I personally held in very high regard, and from whom at least from one of them, I learned quite a bit. So there were figures like Gerhard Kolm, Hans Neisser, basically all the people around the Kiel School of Economics, which was at the time called, or later on called by economic historians, the Keynesians before Keynes. But there was also Adolf Lover, and the person from whom I learned a lot reading his work, Franco Modigliani, who had fled fascist Italy. So it was just great to see Willi working in that renowned institutional environment, and as my two, as the president and the chair of the department mentioned, he was incredibly prolific, really incredibly productive. So our next personal meeting, and that would now be another book title, slide 2. At that time, I wore, about 10 years later, I wore a different hat. I had become a central banker. And Willi asked me to talk about Germany competing with high wages. By the way, the second time Germany was perceived as the sick man of Europe. And that was the environment of the so-called Hartz IV labor market reforms about improving matching in labor markets. And it was essentially about limiting unemployment benefits, size and duration, and reducing the reservation wage. These reforms, by the way, came in the German case with quite significant political upheaval. A group of politicians split off from Social Democrats. They created what was called, very difficult to translate from the German, Electoral Initiative for Labor and Social Justice. And they later on merged with another party from the former Eastern Germany to create the still existing Die Linke in Germany. By the way, if I recall it correctly, that was the first time I met Christian Bruano at the New School. So Willi has also been, in my case, a person who was creating relations with his students, and he has been an outstanding teacher, clearly, because most of his students have been really, are really just proud of having been working with him. I now see on the screen somebody else whom I also met there, I guess years later, Eckhard Ernst, who is now at ELO. So during that time, or afterwards, I met Willi rather frequently. Whenever I was in New York, I self-invited me de facto, and we often spoke about European economic topics. In particular, the workings of Europe's incomplete and therefore very vulnerable monetary union. Incomplete meant it was only a monetary union, disregarding the need to coordinate the regulation of banks, which is just crucial in the European case because more than 80% of all the external financing is going via the banking channel. And also the need basically to have some sort of a fiscal coordination mechanism, which goes beyond what Europeans currently have. So we often spoke about that, but it ultimately led me to team up with Willi and Ibrahim Tahiri to publish a paper on the topic. In that paper, we tried to assess what are the consequences of a fragmentation of European financial markets, basically along national borderlines. And we documented that this comes in particular at a cost for peripheral economies, as they were called after the euro area debt crisis. They governments paid higher interest rates, and as a result of that, spreads of firms and households also rose. So this is a major hurdle still continuing. So ever since, whenever I was in New York, we talked about issues like that. But I also learned from Willi later on, and it has been alluded to by the dean and the president, his work on addressing climate risk. He has written a very highly instructive book with Unor Nyambu on sustainable macro, and what is really convincing about this effort is that it's not concerned with the end point, but trying to understand how we get there. So it's about the medium run macroeconomic environment to create sustainable economic context. And as Teresa said, while it seems to be rather gloomy, Willi and his co-author find ways to be optimists nonetheless. The last point I wanted to mention, and for that I don't have a cover, a book title cover, is Willi's work on carbon wealth tax. He justifies such a carbon wealth tax with the argument that wealth owners, of those who own brown assets, are responsible for a substantially higher share of the public beds which are created. They just produce an enormous amount of the negative externalities which are not accounted for in prices. And therefore, the idea is to use a Musgrave-Lindahl, a Swedish-German proposal, to make them bear the largest share of the cost. And the tax would be on income derived from those assets, and they would be taxed at a normal rate of return. And Willi is continues to pushing on, working on those issues. My final slide, and I hope I haven't overrun time-wise, otherwise just unplug me. My final slide is one of those projects which Willi has anywhere in his pockets and in his wherever. Willi is engaged with a journal in Germany, which is called Vierteljahrshefte zur Arbeits- und Wirtschaftsforschung. And one of the latest issues was exactly about latest two issues was exactly about how to address climate risk. What I find, if I think back on memory lane, which was in my case almost 44 years, there's one common thread, and it begins with Willi's education. He's an engineer, and engineers are looking for solutions. They're not looking for nice problems. They take problems as they are, and then they try to build the tools. And I've profited myself personally of reading Willi's books on asset bubbles, which was published, and I really read the second edition of 2006, which was published before the great financial crisis, and which has a beautiful chapter 8, if I recall it correctly, on how to understand financial crisis from a portfolio balance sheet perspective. He was making a very convincing effort at applying Tobin's model to real data as they were available. And as I said, I learned later on lots of Willi's work, which he and his collaborators have been doing in the realm of addressing the greatest societal externality, climate risk. So happy to celebrate Willi on this occasion. Great to be around with you, and looking very much forward to continue working from him. As Teresa said, I cannot imagine him stopping anything. Thanks a lot for your patience.
Thank you very much, Hans-Helmut. Our next speaker is David Abraham. And David, am I right in thinking you don't have slides?
Correct.
Good. Sit. Stand here. Yeah, yeah. Just a question of policy.
I am not an economist, so my comments may not be as rigorous as those you've just heard, but I hope they will be at least somewhat entertaining. In January of 19... No? In January of 1972, the Council of German State Governors decided on something called the Extremist Resolution, commonly called the Radicals' Decree, which aimed to prevent individuals considered extremists from working in public service roles. It was put into practice as a Berufsverbot, a ban on employment in the public sector of the suspected radicals. Of course, in Germany at the time, virtually the entire educational sector was public, and needless to say, a very large portion of the '68 generation was radical, if not extremist, both in theory and practice. One such person was Willi Semmler, who, though himself a refugee from East Germany, was active in various leftist circles, scholarly and political, in the hotspot of West Berlin. And few spots were hotter than the then political science faculty at the Free University, the Otto Suhr Institute, or OSI, as it was affectionately called. There, Willi was a research assistant from 1973 to '78, where he worked with some notorious figures, including the prolific radical socialist and anti-NATO, anti-American economist Elmar Altvater. Together, they helped edit the journal Prokla, which is short for the problems or issues in class struggle. Partly to get out of Dodge, and partly because there were real economists with numbers and tables and graphs, Willi came to the exile-friendly New School in 1979. This was also the emerging era here and people affiliated with people here, like Bowles, Gintis, Gordon, Wolf, Howell, ERPI, the Union for Radical Political Economists. Capitalism was not seen as a given, and certainly not as crisis-free, let alone humane. I will return to that in a moment. Arriving in New York just before the Reagan-Thatcher assault on unions in the welfare state, the political atmosphere in New York was quite welcoming, and was here in what used to be 65 Fifth Avenue, the working class Klein's department store, with the escalators running up the middle of the building, that I met Willi. And the cause was organizing on behalf of German scholars and activists facing the Berufsverbot. Supporting those folks was easier here in the center of the empire than it was in Germany itself, where the scene became increasingly tense with both terrorism and repression. These became the years, the older people here will remember these names, these became the years of the German Autumn, the Red Army Front, Baader-Meinhof, and the like. We organized, we publicized, we gathered petitions and more on behalf of people who faced becoming collateral damage. Whether we made a difference, I do not know, but it was an opportunity to meet lots of good people and compare understandings of the political moment. In the midst of this turmoil, Willi co-authored with Elmar Altvater and Jürgen Hoffmann the important volume which you just heard reference to, from Wirtschaftswunder to Wirtschaftskrise, from economic miracle to economic crisis. And it was a real economics book. There are 43 tables and 21 graphs between the covers of this book. In the introduction, Willi writes, and this is my translation, "The question that stands at the center of our analysis is this: to what extent does the state enjoy the possibility of using its power to influence the accumulation processes of capital?" Page 13. This is, of course, what the Trump regime is attempting to do, although obviously not in anything like the way the authors had in mind. Further quote, "Changes in class relations, on the other hand, are not simply the chance outcomes of state, corporations, and unions in interaction. Rather, they result from changes in the conditions under which the social reproduction of capital takes place. Accumulation is, after all, a social process." Very astute. Willi and company go on to identify 3 possible social structures of accumulation. Neoliberalism, and I was surprised looking back at this that they were already using the word, neoliberalism, neo-Keynesianism, and neo-monetarism. This is in 1978. And here we are now, nearly half a century later, witnessing an attempt to move American capitalism from one of those regimes to another. The early prediction of neoliberalism was not linked to globalization talk. German production, as the authors noted, has always been export dependent. From Weimar to the present, excluding the Nazi years, Germany has always exported 1/3 of its industrial production. One reason that the combination of Trump's tariffs and Chinese electric car production now inspire doomsday thinking in the German economy. In the end, the crisis that Willi, Elmar, and Jürgen diagnosed at the time seems quite routine and limited compared to what we may be facing now. So how did the political economy system they described then, what I would call capitalism's compromise of social democracy, come to an end? How did a Fordist, Taylorist, mass consumption capitalism, one in which capital could score considerable profit so long as the trade union organized working class could count on a share of production gains and national wealth? And if I may go back to the first speaker for a moment and conjoin what he said with some of what Piketty wrote earlier, the destruction caused by war enabled the growth of surplus to be adequate for wages to rise, as well as a return to capital. Without that massive destruction, we have not seen the equivalent since. What Helmut Schmidt famously called Modell Deutschland, the German model, is no more, a kind of soft left neo-corporatism, and neither is the working class that was as its center. Herewith, I'll pause for a moment to present Willi with an artifact of that period. Namely, all you ever wanted to know about capitalism and how it works. I'm sorry? Yeah. Well, I wanted to make sure it was very safe. I'll leave this for Willi when he gets his turn to speak to summarize for us all. It really is the entire capitalist social structure and economic process on one page. So the end of, and I didn't mark the time when I started, so you'll let me know. Okay. The end of the social democratic variety of liberal democracy has been much talked about for the last decade. Often discussed around the rise of right-wing populist threats, the crisis of liberal democracies and social states is nonetheless its own crisis and is both multifaceted and general. Environment and energy, topics of Willi's later research, security and terrorism, migration, dislocation, declining hegemons, rising autocracies, fiscal crisis, irremediable inequality, all are simultaneously parts of the same picture. most of the people in this room will probably know, of course, the famous statement by Antonio Gramsci in 1930, writing of the multiple crises of war, epidemic, and the flu epidemic after World War I, not entirely different from the COVID epidemic in terms of its dislocations. Imperial collapse, financial instability, mass unemployment, and ascendant fascism. He offered the now famous observation that the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear, unquote. The old ways no longer work, and the new are not yet evident. And we are, as we all know, looking around outside, in a period of our own morbid symptoms attendant to the decline of American hegemony, some classic features of imperial decay: wars on the periphery of the empire, immiseration of the domestic yeomanry or working class, a grotesque rise in inequality, dependence on increasingly mercenary military forces staffed by the lower classes, more visible elite corruption and incompetence, and a decline in popular deference to elites, environmental degradation, and the flow of non-citizen colonial subjects from the periphery to the metropole. Challenges are in contrast, full of energy, China, and engage as rising powers do, first in autarkic economic policies, and then turn to exporting goods and reshaping the world order. By the time of Trump's first election in 2016, another symptom of the Gramscian crisis had become apparent: the links between representatives and represented, parties and constituencies, what we now call de-alignment or disalignment, that had undergirded and sustained social democratic capitalism had seriously frayed. One sees in Germany, for example, the rapid shrinkage of the SPD as it becomes detached from its putative support base. Built around the Keynesian compromise growth pact of the post-war years, high levels of investment, inducing taxation, a measure of tripartite corporatism, in Europe at least, nationally based Fordist mass production capitalism, estimable levels of trade union organization and competition with the communist power, political economy and party politics alike seem to have found, for those Trente Glorieuses, a viable equilibrium between capitalism and democracy. Scholars such as Adam Przeworski and Josta Esping-Andersen have documented the operation of that period very well. And in German, Wolfgang Merkel has a couple of essays which do the same work with exceptional power. Once capitalism went fully global and financialization replaced industrial manufacturing as the core source of profit in rich countries, two important things happened, facilitated, of course, by the political offensive of capital nearly everywhere. It is not a coincidence that the turn to financialization and to the pressure for global export that Reagan and Thatcher also represented an aggressive move of capital against labor. The outcome was that states retreated from and were forced out of the business of seriously regulating capital. Their tax base withered or escaped abroad, and their borrowing efforts produced stagflation and politically dangerous deficits, while subsequent private borrowing often indebted those with few to no assets, documented in the now classic volume of Wolfgang Streeck. Second, social democratic parties shifted away from the interests of their shrinking erstwhile working class bases and came to adopt the third way: identities and interests of newer, better educated professional technical classes, something for some reason the Democratic Party only discovered a few weeks ago. While this was not immediately evident in the political generation of Clinton, Blair, Schroeder, and their epigony, the new labor rights opened a trap door for their own people, the working classes, one that has yet to be closed. Slowly but surely, as these social democrats tied themselves ever more securely to the neoliberal project, working class voters began to stay home or look elsewhere for representatives. The decline in turnout is a strong indication of this. The Obama exception has some distinct peculiarities to it in the US. The rise of right-wing populism and welfare chauvinism with its attendant racism and anti-immigrant sentiments cannot be understood otherwise. Trump's election in 2016 already cannot be understood otherwise. And the narrow escape from his reelection in 2020 only slowly postponed this development. The reorientation of social democracy, 5 minutes, okay. The reorientation of social democracy led the Democrats in this country to resemble the Republicans of 1960, a coalition of big money, Hollywood, suburbanites focused on their personal freedoms, and a plantation-like relationship to cautious Black politicians. Finally, of course, the Hillary Clinton 2016 election revealed all of this. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit now. As this disalignment became clearer, it was also becoming clear that the political system worked only for the rich. Those of you who have not familiar with the work of Larry Bartels should look at this. The correlation between victory in congressional elections and the money that the candidate had is almost perfect. It is the single best and almost perfect correlation there is. If that's true, then why not vote for a rich man claiming to be a tribune of the people? To my knowledge, there's not a single member of the working class to be found in the German Bundestag, unless that changed in the last election. But prior to the last election, there's not a single member of the working class in the German Bundestag. And at best, there were 3 in the US Congress, reduced to 2 when the nurse Cori Bush was taken out in the primary in Missouri last year. The commitment with which the Democratic Party worked to prevent a Bernie Sanders nomination and election is the most direct testimony to its inability to see what kind of predicament it had created for itself. When you block the possibility for change from the left, nationalism and racism will fill the space, and change will come from the right. That was what Trump has accomplished. That is another lesson of German history. By now, the New York Times repeats this stuff at least once a week, right? The dismantlement of the social welfare state, globalized free trade, Rust Belt, going back to its praise of Vance's book, all of that. In Germany, this took the form of the split between Sarah Wagenknecht and her critique of what she called the lifestyle left, what we in the United States experienced as the professional class orientation of the liberal left around issues of culture. The link, that same split in a multi-party system results in the rise and success of the Greens, who become that professional middle class cultural left as the SPD shrinks and shrinks further, and the Linke attempt to maintain a kind of what social democracy once was, combined with a little updating for the post-colonial world. The term progressive, as we've experienced it in the United States in the last decade, has been evacuated of nearly anything to do with workers, and the enlightened classes instead with technocratic, cosmopolitan, global justice proclivities, which perchance happen to include cheap immigrant labor, came to populate that space. And we have seen the revenge in the last election, the revenge of that portion of the population which did not benefit from these. And let me translate this from Wolfgang Streck. I won't take the time to read the German, so I'll just translate on the fly. The prevalence of identity politics had much to do with the widespread inability of left parties to produce a persuasive vision of a solidaristic, less unequal, more future, offering more future policy in better conformance with the environment, less aggressive, paying more attention to collective goods, and a more equitably successful economy. And then there's a verb after that. Okay, 1 minute. In the US, the ongoing struggle to combat racism moved away from the economic realm, and the unbelievable success of writers like Robin DiAngelo testified to the utter bankruptcy of the liberal approach to racial issues. Fighting racism in a country where most white people do not have $500 in the bank for an emergency by telling them that they are privileged is surely cheaper than campaigning for $15 minimum wage or universal health care. Adding a gender neutral or diverse bathroom is surely cheaper than tolerating union organizers. While the professional middle class leading the Democratic Party regularly speaks of systemic, structural, and systematic racism, for example, the remedies proposed are overwhelmingly matters of the heart and not of redistribution, neither of their own assets nor those of capital. I'm going to cut a good bit of this. The demographic expectations that less so in the new school, but if we go uptown about 20 blocks, the demographic expectation that the Browning of America would substitute for progressive ideological politics, that demographics would create a more progressive America, have fallen flat on their face as the Democrats come to terms with the Trump voter base, who it was, who it has been, and who it might still increasingly be. So let me just close with Adolf Reed on this point. Some of you may know a Black socialist scholar, Adolf Reed. The difference between a politics that presumes the broad working class as its crucial constituency and a source of political agency, and one that sees groups defined by ascription, those like race or gender, based on what one supposedly is rather than what one does, as most important or central. It's not a difference between two different articulations of left or progressive politics. There's a political difference that reflects the social locations and aspirations of different classes, and the political perspectives and objectives that emerge from those different class locations can be antagonistic. It is instructive in this regard that race reductionist political discourse racializes the working class as white and denies the significance of egalitarian redistribution for Black Americans, who are instead folded into the concerns articulated by the professional and middle class agenda setting straight up, unquote. Perhaps, skip the rest, perhaps the autocratic American version of fascism, or whatever one might deem Trumpism to be, will give us pause to reconsider where Willi and company left off in 1979 with the transformation of a capitalist economy and a working class that will enable us to recreate something that connects the masses of people and progressive social and economic agenda. Thank you.